I'm 24, and this happened 5 years ago when I was 19. I was conducting an online transaction on a site called Alks, which is similar to Craigslist. It's an online app where you can see items being sold by random strangers, and all you have to do is make a call and meet up. I was looking for a cheap sweater for my trip to Japan the following week. After several minutes of scrolling, I came across an ad with exactly what I was looking for. A Korean-style female fur sweater for just 300 pesos, about $6. It was perfect. I had issue with it. The meetup point was at the LRT train station at 8 p.m. because the seller was too busy at work. I decided, what the heck? It's a public place anyway. I called the owner and we had a quick convo. He sounded like a strict guy, but I asked him when we could meet up. He responded, "Tonight at 8 p.m. sharp." I said sure. But this recklessness of mine is what I regret the most. I arrived at the meeting place at 7:58 p.m. It was really empty, and I was sure I was the only person in the station. It was a cold night in November, and I eagerly awaited warming myself with my coat. Honestly, I'm the kind of girl who's comfortable wearing a sweater even when it's hot. I was sitting on a bench when the clock ticked 8 o'clock, when suddenly someone covered half of my face with a scarf with a really strange scent. I fell unconscious. As I woke up, I found myself in a van with 4 guys, my wrists handcuffed behind my back. I asked the man what they wanted and to please let me go. Tears began to fall from my eyes. But then, one of the guys touched my face and said, "It's our first time ever tasting a beautiful girl like you." I kept on crying and shouted, "Please, I want to go home, please." The guy next to me choked me, shouting that I needed to shut up. I tried to resist, but my eyes started to roll back in my head. He stopped, but it was taking a long time for me to catch my breath. I looked out the window and saw a checkpoint lane. For the first time in my life, I was so glad that the authorities had permission to check the van. But the guy next to me reached for a gun, a really big gun. Knowing this was my only chance, I found the strength to shout and cried out, "Officer, please help! They have a gun!" The 2 officers immediately grabbed their guns, one shooting at the tires, the other aiming for the man next to me. The officer shot him in the head. I never thought I'd witness such a thing in my life. One of the officers carried me out of the van, and I passed out moments later. I woke up the next day in a hospital bed. My parents were there, crying and asking me what happened. I told them the truth, that I was buying a sweater online. But I suddenly snapped. I cried and cried, saying, "Please help, please help." Since then, I've had to go to a psychiatrist to recover from mental instability and anxiety, and it should go without saying, but I never ever want to buy anything online, ever again.
When I was 7 or 8 years old, my parents used to take me to this beach cafe in our town. It had a pool and the cafe was right next to the beach. The family that owned the cafe were my family's close friends, so I spent a lot of my childhood there. The best part about the beach is that when you passed the cafe and the playground, there was a lot of sand and a net for volleyball. As kids, my friends and I would always play there. One ordinary summer night, there was quite a few of us playing in the sand, making castles and doing other things. All of a sudden, I heard a noise behind me in the bushes, right where the sand ended. I should mention that there were woods around the whole place, but it wasn't deep or anything. I was a brave kid, so I just brushed it off as being a cat or animal of some sort, and continued to play. However, when I looked up at my friends, who were now quiet and staying still, I got the chills. I noticed that all of their eyes had widened. They were staring at me, or rather at whatever was behind me. The shock kicked in, and I felt like I was going to faint. I started shaking. I didn't even want to turn around. But when I felt something cold on the back of my neck, that was the last straw. I started running full speed towards the cafe filled with people, and my friends immediately followed behind me. There were 6 children crying and screaming at the top of our lungs. I remember finally clinging to my mom and crying in her arms. Soon after, the sound of sirens followed by police cars parked in front filled the air. When the adults talked to the police, my friends and I were confused. I still didn't know what was behind me, so I asked my oldest friend in the group, who was 10 years old and talking to his dad. It turns out there was this crazy old guy who robbed a lady and stabbed her to death not so far away from here. My friends told me he appeared behind me smiling like a sick clown. He was holding a knife and pressing it against the back of my neck. That must have been the cold thing I felt. From then on, I never stayed far away from the cafe when the sun went down. And thankfully, they caught the guy.
This happened a little over 20 years ago. I was 10 years old and my sister was 6. We grew up in a small town, raised only by our hardworking mother. It started when school was nearly finished for the year. The nights were late because my sister was up all night crying about a witch. Anyway, my mother started receiving odd calls once in a while at work.
I need one of your children.
Mom figures it was some stupid prank and ignored it. But then she started receiving calls daily. Eventually, she was receiving a call most nights at our home. She reported it to the police, and they said whoever was calling was using random payphones. There wasn't much they could do about it. So she had both her work and home number changed. One night around 10 or so, there was a frantic knock on her door. Mom looked out through the window and saw a lady with long hair in her 60s. Not knowing her, Mom went near the locked door and asked what she wanted. The lady asked if she could come inside because she was in a car accident. Mom said she would call the police for her and told her to wait outside. There was a pause.
No, don't call the cops.
Mom thought this was strange and started walking to the phone. Immediately again, a banging on the door. Mom ran to the phone and looked out the window to see the lady staring at her. She coldly said,
Dorothy Margaret, I want one of your children. Dorothy Margaret, I want one of your children.
She kept repeating it until Mom noticed flashing lights of police approaching, and she left. The police searched everywhere and kept a car outside each night for a week. Nothing. A few weeks later, summer finally started and my sister wasn't having the nightmares anymore about the witch. We were at one of my baseball games and my mother was talking to a teacher at my sister's school and telling her what happened. The teacher said,
Oh, it sounds like your stepmother.
Mom looked back confused and said she doesn't have a stepmother. The teacher's face turned white. A while ago, a lady in her 60s would come watch the children play at lunch. She said she was my mother's stepmom and liked to watch my sister at lunch. She reported it again to the police and they checked camera footage. Sure enough, on a faraway park bench, there was an old lady most lunchtimes. They noticed she was always coming from the woods, so the police did a search and found an old shanty shack type of place. It had old blankets and a fire pit, and it had pictures she had drawn of us. That was the last time we ever heard of her. When summer was ending, my sister started having the nightmares of the witch again. Mom asked why she was getting scared again, and she said,
Because she comes to school and watches us.
The witch was the old lady.
I met a terrible creep at a McDonald's restaurant. I was running errands with my husband one day when I was 6 months pregnant. The day started out normal as we took the subway together. All of a sudden, I felt nauseous and I could feel that I had to vomit immediately. I quickly gave my bag to my husband and told him I had to run to the nearest bathroom. I bolted away at the next stop as I could not hold it in any longer. As I exited the underground, I ran into the nearest restaurant, a McDonald's. I hurried to the bathroom, where I passed a middle-aged man who was standing at the entrance of the bathroom. I paid no attention and pushed past him to get in. As I finally arrived to the bathroom, I immediately started puking. I never felt so sick my entire life. That's when the door handle of the bathroom started moving. I quickly pushed the door to keep it closed and yelled that it was busy, but the person on the other side pushed back. As that person managed to push harder, I saw the guy that was at the entrance. He had curly hair. I freaked out and slammed the door shut and started yelling for help. The man was insistent and kept trying to get in. I started puking again, so I was left with trying to hold the door with my foot as he kept banging it harder and harder. I continued yelling in the direction of the window of the stall as I heard people saying that there was a girl who needed help. Suddenly, the guy stopped banging the door and everything got quiet. I tried to calm myself down while still holding the door shut just in case. Then, I saw curly hair and a hand trying to get me from under the door, which had a pretty large gap. I started screaming again as I started kicking his face. At this point, I was desperate. I had no phone, no bag, and my husband was probably roaming the city looking for me. Then, I heard a man yell, and the creep suddenly getting away quickly. I kept the door shut when I heard a male voice telling me to come out and that it was okay. I reluctantly opened the door to find the manager of the McDonald's confused and shocked. I told him what happened and he called the police. With all the commotion, my husband finally found me. When the police arrived, I gave the police a description, but they never found the guy.
It was the summer before 9th grade. I was at my friend's family pool party, and there were tons of people there. At one point, while my friend, let's call her Lily, went to get some sodas for us, a man came up to me. I didn't recognize him, but since it was my friend's party, it made sense for me to not know everyone there. He smiled at me. He looked as though he hadn't shaved in days, and his eyes never looked quite directly at me. I stepped backwards, feeling uncomfortable. "Hello," he said. Hi," I replied. "What's your name?" he asked. I supposed that a first name wouldn't hurt, seeing as we were surrounded by tons of people in my friend's backyard. I'm Carly," I said. "What's yours?" "Rick," he replied smoothly. "Are you having fun with Lily?" Some of my discomfort eased. "I'm her parents' friend," he continued, stepping closer to my face. His eyes weren't focused, and his breath smelled like alcohol, even though it was early in the day. I grew even more uncomfortable and stepped away, waving goodbye awkwardly. When I turned around, he was gone. I told Lily about this, and she mentioned it to her parents. Her parents said that they didn't know Rick, which kind of freaked me out. But they told me that it could have been one of their friends who brought him over. So I shrugged it off and assumed everything was fine. After the party ended, Lily and I were having a sleepover at her house. Her parents had gone over to visit her elder sister to take some leftovers to her, since she had not been feeling well and couldn't attend the party. So we were home alone with her elder brother. Lily and I were playing a game in her bedroom when her dad called her. He asked her to please go and turn off the pool lights, since he had forgotten. Lily agreed and we stepped outside into the backyard. I waited on the back porch, reading a text from another friend, while she went to turn off the lights. Once she was finished, we stepped back inside, locking the door, and went back upstairs to continue playing our game. At one point, Lily asked me to make sure the curtains were closed properly, and when I did, I happened to look outside, and I noticed that all the pool lights were on again. "Lily?" I asked, getting a strange feeling. "You turned off the pool lights, right?" "Yeah, I did," she replied, coming to look. Now there was a figure swimming laps in the pool, even though we couldn't see his face. It's probably just Cody," Lily replied, speaking of her brother. "Come on, let's go scare him." We walked down to the pool and slid open the back door. Waiting behind the bushes, we could see the top of his head bobbing in the water. We were going to jump out and scare him at any moment. But then I looked up at one of the windows of the house. The curtains were open. Suddenly, I saw the face of Cody illuminated as he turned on his bedroom lights. I grasped Lily's arm, and we both knew the person in the pool was not, in fact, Cody. We hadn't brought our phones with us in case we would get wet, and if we ran back around, there was a chance the stranger could see us before we got back to the house. We tried to wave to Cody, but he couldn't see us. Suddenly, splashing in the pool stopped. My heart dropped and I could hear each of my panicked heartbeats. A hand suddenly gripped my arm and flung me forward, and I screamed, and Lily did as well. I looked up, and there was Rick. His facial expression I will never forget. I've never seen someone with such a creepy smile. I yelled, and soon my mouth was filled with water as he chucked me in the pool, and he actually held me underwater. I choked for breath and realized he had grabbed Lily's arm as well, although she wasn't in the water. He was strong and clearly ill. He yelled, "Time to swim!" Somehow Lily managed to kick him in the face hard enough to run away, slamming the door behind her. He continued to hold me, laughing as I flailed for breath. Just as I felt I was about to die, police sirens were heard on the surface. He picked me up and threw me on the ground, breaking my arm. He ran away. The police came and questioned me, but he was never found. I will never forget that moment. I thought I was truly going to die. Nor will I forget those creepy, unfocused eyes. From then on, I've been terrified to be outside at night, especially in a pool.
I was driving home from work one night around 9 p.m. midweek, so the roads were quiet. As I was driving downhill, I heard a sound that was like a jet engine roaring behind me. The next thing I know, a car goes flying past me going twice the speed limit. It looked like a fairly old and crappy car, and the car started to get the speed wobbles. Then one of the tires came flying off and rolled at high speeds downhill while the car spun out and crashed. I stopped my car to make sure whoever was inside was okay. A guy got out of the car and looked over at me, and then started moving extremely quickly towards me. I don't know why, but I hit my internal locks on the car, which was fortunate, because no more than 2 seconds later, the guy started grabbing at the driver's side door and smashing on my windscreen with his fists trying to get in. I'll never forget the look he had in his eyes. I put my foot down on the accelerator and drove off back home. I decided to swap cars once I got home and drove back to see what was going on. I saw 2 fire trucks and about 4 police close to where the incident happened. When I got back to the crash site, the guy was no longer there, so I decided to head home. The next day at work, I was online and bored reading the news when I saw an article that shocked me. The article was about a guy who had been in a police chase for 1 hour, and the police stopped chasing him because it was becoming too dangerous. Turns out the guy was high on meth, had stolen a car an hour's drive away, and had been in a hot pursuit since. After crashing the car, the guy apparently crossed to the other side of the road and hailed the first car that appeared, which was a taxi. He got into the taxi and stole it. In the process, he pushed the driver out of the driver's side door, and the driver got stuck and dragged at speeds. The driver died from the incident. I called the police and had a detective assigned to me. He fingerprint checked my car and got a statement. I had to testify in the Supreme Court as a key witness in a murder trial. The guy got 30 years, and they told me that my testimony was one of the main factors in convicting him. I often think back to that night and wonder if I hadn't locked my doors, would I have been the one who got murdered?
My name is Milo. I'm 14 years old, but this happened about a year ago. One day, I was having a sleepover with my two best friends, Ben and Michael, to celebrate Ben's birthday. Ben wanted to go camping and have a bonfire, so we all set up our tents for a fun night. When we set everything up, we talked about the usual teenage boy stuff, sports, cars, and girls. As the night progressed, Ben began to tell us about a man from our town who was on the run from the police. He said that the man lurked around in the darkness and kidnapped teenage boys. He grabs you by the legs and drags you through the forest while looking for more kids to prey on, Ben said. We all burst out with laughter at how ridiculous it sounded. Nothing like that would ever happen in our town, right? At least, that's what we thought. We all started to feel sleepy and decided to call it a night. During the middle of the night, I got out of my tent to use the bathroom on one of the trees nearby. But when I was done, I looked back to see a man warming his hands on our fire, and 3 small, dark figures hid behind him, each looking like a starved child. I screamed in fear, waking my friends who freaked out when they saw him. We sprinted out of the forest to warn people about the man, but nobody in town believed us. When it was light outside the next morning, we went back to the forest to collect our gear and go home. Everything was there, but a note was left on the ground. It read, "Grabs you by the legs and drags you," with a smiley face drawn at the end. We alerted the police and never went back to that forest again.
About 10 years ago when I was 12, I would always go into the nearby woods with my friends for most of the day. One night, we left pretty late. Usually I got home before dark, but today, I knew I wouldn't make it back, and I already knew my parents would be mad at me. We were walking in a group for a few blocks, then a couple of my friends split from us to go to their house. I started to notice that a van kept driving past us. I didn't think anything of it. And then my last friend split to go to her house. I had about 5 to 10 minutes left until mine. Then I see that van again, and it pulled up right beside me and stopped. The driver rolled down the front window. Then she told me that she can't find her son and she's been looking all evening. And she asked me if I seen him. I looked and I said no. Then she asked me if I wanted to get in her van to help find him. I said no again, and I looked forward. Then she asked me, am I sure? I didn't answer and I started to walk faster. Then all of a sudden, there was some guy in her back seat that said, "Let's just fucking snatch her." I looked at the van for a split second as the woman looked in the back seat and she sped up to park on the side of the street. I started running through yards. I heard the doors open and shut on the van, but I didn't look back until I got home. Nobody followed me. I told my parents and we called the cops. I never missed curfew after that.
I'm scared of the dark, and I have a good reason for it. You might be thinking, so? Almost everyone is scared of the dark because something happened to them. Well, that is true for me too. Here's my story. About 2 years ago, I ran away from home. I don't know just what I was thinking at the time, but I left with no food, no water, no belongings, and no coat. It was a very rainy day, and I sensed that I should either find shelter or I'd be soaking wet. So I decided to walk to my school and stay there for a few hours to dry off, as I was already wet and cold on a rainy day. As I arrived, I laid down my head and quickly fell asleep. And when I woke up, it was pitch black outside, and I could barely make out anything. I didn't have a watch or anything that tells the time, so I assumed it was midnight. At least it stopped raining, I thought. I decided to just go back home, as I wasn't far and I was very hungry that time. As I got up, I stopped. There was something in front of me, under a streetlight, about 50 yards away. It was a man about 6 feet tall, and he was wearing a black coat with a hoodie over his face, so I couldn't see his face. At first, I thought it was my dad who had come to look for me, so I felt relief. But I didn't want to get into trouble, so I hid in a bush nearby and peeked out. The man was standing there and looked around for what it seemed like a half an hour. Then, under the light of the streetlight, he pulled something out of his pocket. I couldn't make it out at first, but then I realized it was a kitchen knife. Then he started to run toward the bushes. No, towards me. Exactly. I grew frightened and sprinted out of the bushes like an arrow. He already knew I was there. I didn't stop running until I got home without ever looking back. So I survived. But to this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I didn't run on that day. Or worse, what would have happened if I didn't wake up at the school? I developed my fear of the dark from this incident. It's so bad that now I have to sleep with a nightlight or the hallway light occasionally. Because I'm afraid that the man whom I saw will kill me or kidnap me someday if I don't turn the light on. This fact happened when I was 15 years old, beginning of last year, 2018, when I finally got to sophomore year here in Brazil. It was an ordinary Friday night. Suddenly, I felt a little bit hungry, so I decided to put on some clothes and go to the snack bar. It was barely 10 minutes from my house. I usually pass through the alley to go to the snack bar, but that time, everything was so creepy in there. When I was halfway there, it was dark, empty, abnormally cold and gloomy. I felt slightly intimidated, but there was nothing there that could really harm me. So I decided to just go through that alley. Then I thought, nothing's gonna happen. I kept going until I suddenly heard something weird on the other side of the alley. There was a man in there, staring at the walls in hunchback stance, grunting weirdly. I found that incredibly creepy. But I was nearly at the snack bar, so all I needed was just to get out of that alley. Walk 1 minute more and I finally would get there, instead of making it all the way home with empty hands. Thus, I decided to ignore him and pass through after all. I finally passed through him. He turned to me and stared at me with a creepy smile, which made me walk a little bit faster, trying to avoid him. Then, suddenly, I heard a grunt and quick steps behind me. When I looked back, it was him. We were barely 2 feet away from each other. He had a kitchen knife in his right hand and jumped on me with amazing speed and tried to stab me. I managed to grab both of his arms before he could get me. However, since he was charging at me, he still had more energy to push me back and force me against a wall. I was terrified with all of that. I knew I would die if I didn't fight back. Back then, I was already trained in some martial arts to defend myself, but that I thought I'd never need to use that skill to defend my life until now. So, in a sudden burst of adrenaline, I managed to twist the wrist which he was holding the knife, kicking his stomach and punching him mercilessly in the face several times. In the end, his face was bleeding so much, but his body was ignoring the pain of the blows in his body and only focusing on killing me. Finally, I used a training that I took before to twist both of his wrists and elbows harshly at the same time, forced in two different directions, and kicked the backside of his leg, putting him to the ground until ultimately he could drop the knife. It wasn't easy because he was struggling and punching my back and somehow trying to jump on me. But since I had his arm under my grasp, he couldn't do much without breaking himself. I slammed his head in the concrete ground, stunning him, then kept striking his face desperately while kneeling over his arm so he wouldn't be able to react or reach his knife again. And finally, he was out cold, bleeding a lot. My knuckles were full of blood and hurt. So I got up, took his knife, throwing it far away from there, and ran away from him. I finally got to the snack bar, washed my hands in there, and did everything I had to do before going back home. But obviously, I didn't take the same path as I did before. But there were things that got much creepier. That was at the entrance of my apartment, where I heard screams coming from the other side of the street. It was the same crazy man. Now, seeming like he was possessed by a demon, and he was slamming his head on the iron door of my building's entrance. His face was horribly deformed and scarred from our fight. That freaked me out completely. My parents were on a trip, and the watchman of our building was on vacation. I wasn't going to fight that man again, so I decided to rush to my girlfriend's house. When I got there, she was home alone. She looked worried because I was looking pale, and there were still some marks of the man's blood on my clothes. I explained everything to her, and we called the police to come by my building. And when they arrived, the man was still in the entrance trying to force the doors unsuccessfully. When he saw the police, he attacked them, but got quickly dominated by the cops. They explained that he was probably a crazy psycho in the streets looking for prey to rape, kill, or do anything he wanted to the person. So they sent him to a high-security mental asylum for criminals far away from my house. I feel so lucky that I survived that day, and I'm hoping that I will never see that man again.
When I was 10 or 11, my cousin and aunt visited us. We had fun throughout the day, and my aunt and cousin decided to sleep at my other aunt's house before leaving early in the morning. After such a fun day, I insisted upon sleeping at my aunt's house too, so I could spend more time with everyone. Later that night, we all fell asleep in the guest room, the only room that was available for us. I woke up suddenly at 5 a.m. I heard my mom and other aunt talking, so I was definitely awake. I saw that my cousin and aunt's things weren't there anymore, so I assumed they'd already left. I was about to fall back asleep. I looked at my left and saw someone sleeping beside me. I was about to hug her, thinking it was my 21-year-old girl cousin. But then I saw her face. She wasn't my cousin at all. She was someone I didn't know. But she looked about the age of my cousin. She wore pajamas and a black shirt, and all I could do was stare at her. She started doing strange things, like stretching her legs up and down and just focusing on the ceiling. It was all so odd. But feeling tired, I eventually drifted off to sleep like nothing had happened. I woke up at 8 a.m., looking at my left, and she was gone. I told everything to my mom and every family member in the house, but no one knew what I had experienced or who the girl was. My dad told me that my third eye was starting to see more, but I didn't really believe that. I'm turning 13 now, and that experience still remains a mystery to me. It never happen to me again. And hopefully it won't.
Hi, my name is Adil, and this is a true story. The police have finished this case, and the man is in prison now. I was 14 at the time this took place. I was in a school and sitting in a history lesson that was so boring. My friend Noel, who was sitting opposite me, said I could come over on Saturday, as his parents were not going to be there because they were going on a weekend away. That meant we could stay up as long as we wanted. This was not uncommon, as we both invited each other to stay at one another's house, and I thought we were going to have a great time. Saturday came and I was so ready. I packed my essentials like my toothbrush, my new game, and my pepper spray. My parents always made me carry it, and I didn't mind because it made me feel safe too. I went on my way, and 30 minutes later, after walking, arrived to Noel's house. As he opened the door, he looked a little tense and shifty. I walked in and locked the door after me, to which he became even more anxious. I asked him if everything was all right, and he said it was. Not trying to put a down on the evening, I asked him if we could play the new game I bought. He wasn't really interested, but said yes anyway. After 30 minutes of watching him not playing and just holding the controller in his hand, I switched off the TV and asked him what was going on. To which he replied, "I need your help." I asked him what he needed my help for. He told me that this man who added him on Facebook was actually stalking him in real life, and as to how he wanted to meet Noel. He warned him that if he told his parents, he would kill them. So Noel, being the stupid idiot, he told him to come at 8 p.m., 5 minutes from now. He was scared, so he asked me to come to this meeting to get rid of him, and that if he had told me at school, I never would have agreed to come. He was right. I felt betrayed that he brought me here under false pretenses. I was also angry at his stupidity of him giving his address away as well. However, I had no time to argue. I was just glad he told me about this guy. I grabbed my pepper spray and just sat there on the couch. The doorbell rang at 8 p.m. I just sat there hoping he would leave after a little bit. However, then I started to hear scratching and realized he was breaking in with some sort of tool. I quickly ran into the kitchen with Noel, and we heard the door lock get broken, and someone kicked the door in. The lights were on, and we were hiding behind the large fridge. The man, in a deep voice, shouted, "Noel!" We didn't reply, and then he shouted, "Noel, where the heck are you? I'm going to kill you." I had a plan. At this point, I pushed Noel out from behind the fridge. Noel started going back, and the man was walking forward, chuckling. As soon as he came near the distance of the fridge, I shot out and sprayed pepper spray in his eyes. He screamed in pain and then started swinging the screwdriver in his hand. I grabbed the screwdriver and picked up a pan laying there and hit him on the head. He blacked out. He was dressed in a smart suit and was clean-shaven. We called the police and later found out that he was a man who was being monitored because there were several complaints of stalking and threatening behavior. They also found many tools in a bag he left near the door that would dismember a body. Thankfully, this sicko didn't kill anyone. However, I'm now happy that Noel called me because I dread to think what would have happened if I wasn't there.